who have confirmed the death of the singer George Michael at the age of 53.
Probably one of the only celebrities I could say that I know well is Elton, and Elton loves celebrities.
I tried to help.
I try to help, but you can't help people who don't want to help themselves.
This is for you, George Michael. I love you. I think you're amazing.
He never talked about that night. Not in interviews, not to his friends, not to the people who thought they knew him best, but those who were close, the ones who saw him afterward, said something inside him shifted. It wasn't visible, it was audible. You could hear it in his voice, a heaviness, like someone who'd been carrying too much truth for too long. Because before the silence, there was laughter. Before the walls and the rumors and the misunderstanding, there was friendship. The kind that only happens when two people see the same darkness in each other and choose to walk through it anyway. In the late 1980s, they were inseparable. George Michael, a golden-voiced prodigy, barely out of his 20s, fresh from the glitter of Wham, desperate to be taken seriously, and Elton John, the icon, the veteran who'd lived through every storm fame could offer and somehow came out still singing. They weren't rivals. Not then. They were allies. Two artists who understood what it meant to be consumed by the world that adored them, to have millions love you, but to wake up each morning feeling utterly alone. When George sang beside Elton, that unforgettable performance of Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, it wasn't just music, it was communion. Two voices, one soaring and one trembling, meeting in midair, catching light. The audience didn't just hear it, they felt it. It was as if two generations of loneliness had found each other, and in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something lasting. Elton took him under his wing. He'd seen himself in George, the perfectionism, the secrecy, the need to hide pain behind glamour, and George admired him, feared him even, not for his fame but for his courage to live loud when George could not. But in every friendship built on empathy, there's a shadow, a silent question that hangs over every laugh. Which one of us will survive this? At first, they were each other's lifelines. Elton would visit George's shows, praising him as the future of British pop, telling journalists that George Michael was a once-in-a-generation talent. George returned the kindness quietly, never one for loud declarations, his gratitude expressed in glances, in lyrics, in that faint smile when Elton walked into the room. But fame, like gravity, pulls differently on each soul. Elton had learned to live with it, to talk, to fight, to expose his wounds before others could. George, on the other hand, recoiled from it. He wanted privacy, control, peace. He wanted to disappear from the noise, even if it meant disappearing from those who loved him. And slowly, silence began to creep into their friendship. Not anger, not betrayal, just silence. The kind that builds so quietly, you don't realize it's become a wall until you're standing on the other side of it. There were whispers, of course. Some said it was ego, that George didn't like being offered help by someone louder, older, and famously unfiltered. Others said it was concern, that Elton saw George spiraling and tried to intervene. No one knows what was said behind closed doors, but people who were there remember one thing. George walked away from that conversation different. He stopped returning calls. He avoided events. He retreated further into himself. And when he spoke about fame, his tone had changed. He called it a beast that devours everything it touches. Fame had given him everything, and yet it had stolen his peace. And maybe, in trying to protect himself from that world, he pushed away the one friend who was trying to pull him back. Elton John, meanwhile, did what Elton always did. He spoke the truth as he saw it, publicly, lovingly, but too loudly. He told a reporter that George needed help, that he wasn't happy, that he'd shut himself off from everyone who cared. To Elton, those words were love. To George, they were betrayal, because when you've spent your life hiding pain, nothing hurts more than having someone name it for you. And that was the breaking point, the line neither would cross again. From then on, there were no more duets, no phone calls, just silence, years of it. And yet, if you listen closely, you can hear the ghost of that friendship in his music, in the tremor of Jesus to a Child.
Like Jesus to a child.
In the ache of praying for time.
Do you think we have time?
In the pauses that felt like confessions no one was meant to hear. He never said what happened, but he didn't have to. The music carried the secret. Some say "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me" became a song of irony. The same man who once shared that stage now stood in darkness alone. Others say it was forgiveness, sung too late to be heard, because the truth isn't that fame destroyed them. Fame just exposed what love couldn't fix. The distance between two souls trying to save each other in completely different ways. And when the silence finally settled between them, it wasn't made of anger, it was made of grief. The grief of two men who understood each other too well and couldn't bear to keep looking in the mirror. So he never talked about that night. He let the world keep guessing. But those who knew him best say that from then on, every song he sang was a letter, never sent. A quiet apology wrapped in melody, addressed to someone he still called friend. And the question that haunted him and still haunts the music remains, when does love stop saving us and start breaking us instead? By the early 2000s, George Michael's world had become quieter, almost too quiet. The man who once filled arenas with light now avoided even the smallest stage. He stopped touring, stopped appearing, stopped letting people in. Those who loved him said he was retreating. Those who worked with him said he was hiding. But George himself called it something else, survival. He had lived through fame's cruelest years, the relentless press, the public scandals, the tabloid intrusions that treated heartbreak like entertainment. And when he finally found peace, or something close to it, he wasn't about to let anyone take it away. But that peace came at a price. It meant distance, even from the people who'd once meant everything to him, including Elton. For years, Elton had watched George pull further and further from the world. He'd seen the same patterns before, the withdrawal, the denial, the careful masking of pain with control. He recognized it because he'd lived it. So when he finally spoke out, it wasn't from malice, it was from heartbreak. In 2004, Elton John gave an interview that would change everything. He said George had shut himself off from the world, that he'd lost touch with the people who cared about him. He called it sad. He said he worried, and maybe in another world, George would have heard the love behind those words. But at that moment, fragile, exhausted, cornered, he only heard exposure, the private man's greatest fear, being understood too publicly, because George Michael's silence wasn't a cry for help, it was his armor. Every wall he built was meant to protect something sacred, his privacy, his pride, his carefully controlled identity, and Elton, in trying to break through, had unknowingly shattered it. The tabloids pounced, headlines turned compassion into conflict. Elton slams George Michael, feud of the pop legends. It wasn't a feud, not really. It was grief dressed up as gossip, but once the story escaped into the world, neither man could pull it back. George responded the only way he knew how, through music. In 2005, when he released Patience, fans noticed something strange. The lyrics were sharper, lonelier, and the title itself felt like a message, a plea for space, a warning to those who wanted to fix him. Around that time, George gave an interview that many believed was directed at Elton. He said, "I don't need anyone diagnosing me in public." His voice was calm, but his eyes gave him away. They carried the sadness of someone who'd been betrayed by love that spoke too loudly. And so began a long, unspoken Cold War, a decade of interviews that avoided names but not meaning, of smiles that didn't reach the eyes, of award shows where two men who once shared a microphone now pretended not to see each other. Friends said George was hurt, but Elton was haunted. He'd tried to save a friend and lost him instead. Behind the scenes, there were attempts to reconcile. Mutual friends would mention the other's name softly, testing the air, searching for warmth, but George would only shake his head. "Not now," he'd say, "not like this." And yet, despite the distance, neither could quite let go. When George released An Easier Affair, its cryptic lyrics about fame, loneliness, and forgiveness felt like fragments of a conversation that never happened, a love letter buried beneath bitterness. Insiders would later whisper that Elton wrote him letters too, never made public, never confirmed. Just quiet gestures that said, "I'm still here. I didn't mean to lose you." That part remains speculation, but it fits the rhythm of both men's hearts. As the years went on, George retreated further into privacy, and Elton's world grew louder. Concerts, causes, interviews. Two parallel lives running on opposite sides of the same highway, never quite touching, always glancing back in the rearview mirror. But even in the silence, their connection refused to die. Because every time George appeared unexpectedly, Whether on radio or charity stages, Elton's name was there, floating unspoken in the air, like a memory that refused to fade. There's a clip, rarely mentioned, of George at a private dinner, quietly singing a few lines of "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me." His voice is softer now, trembling, full of unspoken apology. And when someone asked him later if he missed Elton, he smiled faintly and said, "I miss the way he used to make me laugh." That single sentence, fragile, almost whispered, said everything. The tension wasn't hate, it wasn't ego, it was sorrow for what fame had done and what pride had refused to undo. Because fame doesn't just test love, it exposes it. It shows you whether it was built for applause or for silence. And between George and Elton, the silence had become unbearable. There isn't one single moment you can point to, no headline that explains it, no camera that caught it, just a night, a quiet night when two friends stopped being friends. Some say it happened after an interview. Elton had once again spoken out, saying George needed to find joy again. It sounded harmless, even kind. But to George, it was salt in a wound the world was already picking at. Others say it was an encounter at an awards show. Brief, tense, unfinished. George turned to leave. Elton reached out, and George's hand brushed past his. A touch that once meant warmth now felt like a reminder of everything they'd lost. No one knows for sure which story is true, but everyone agrees on one thing. After that, they never stood in the same room again. It's strange, isn't it, how silence can sound louder than applause. For years, their friendship had been an anthem. Now it was an echo. George stopped mentioning Elton's name altogether. When asked, he'd simply say, "We're different people now." But the tone, calm, clipped, and final, said much more than the words ever could. Inside, he was unraveling. The isolation that once felt like safety began to feel like punishment. The world that had worshipped him had become unbearable, and the one person who might have understood it best was the same person he couldn't forgive. Fame had turned their empathy into distance. Two men who'd once saved each other from loneliness were now mirrors reflecting regret. George spent his nights writing, smoking, pacing. He'd stay up until dawn, the light of his cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. He'd listen to old recordings, faith, older, songs from the last century, not as a singer, but as a ghost revisiting rooms he could never live in again. Meanwhile, Elton carried his own guilt, one he rarely spoke of. Friends recall him turning quiet whenever George's name came up. He'd change the subject, fidget, look away. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't anger that came out, it was sadness. He'd say, "He doesn't want me in his life. I have to respect that." But even in acceptance, there was longing, because both men were driven by the same fire, the same impossible need to connect and to hide at the same time, to be seen and yet misunderstood. And that's what made their friendship so fragile. They weren't opposites, they were two alike. Then came the years of scandal and struggle, the arrests, the headlines, the unending press obsession. George's private pain became a circus, and the man who once sang about faith was now trapped in disbelief. Elton wanted to call him. He almost did, several times. But every time his hand reached for the phone, he stopped, because he knew George wouldn't answer. And George, he missed him too. There were notes found later, scribbles in diaries, half lyrics never released, lines like, "Sometimes love is louder when it leaves. Forgiveness doesn't always sound like words." No one knows who those were for, but people close to him believe they were letters never sent to the man he once called brother. In his last major interview, George was asked about friendship, whether he still believed in it. He smiled, almost shyly, and said, "Real friendship is quiet. It's what survives the noise." It was as if he was talking to someone who wasn't in the room. Maybe he was. By then the damage was done. The bond that began in music had ended in silence, not out of hate, but out of heartbreak. Elton, for all his openness, never tried again, and George, for all his privacy, never truly let go. They were two men circling the same memory, each waiting for the other to speak first, and when the world looked at them, it saw icons, legends, but what they saw was the space between them. Because fame doesn't just steal time, it steals understanding. It makes you forget who you were before the spotlight found you, and that's what it did to them. It took two souls who could have saved each other and turned them into stories told in past tense. So by the time the sun finally did go down on them, there was nothing left to say, just music and silence. When George Michael died on Christmas Day in 2016, the news broke like a whisper that turned into a storm. For hours, fans didn't believe it. It felt impossible that a voice so full of life, so saturated with ache and grace, could simply go quiet. But somewhere in a quiet corner of his home, Elton John wept. He didn't post anything at first, didn't rush to the cameras or the papers, just silence. Until a few days later when he finally spoke, "I have lost a beloved friend, the kindest, most generous soul." He said George's talent was beyond measure, but his heart was what he'd remember. Those words sounded like love, but if you listened closely, they also sounded like regret. Because after all the noise, all the years of silence, they never found their way back to each other. There were no final words, no late-night phone call, no quiet reconciliation, and that haunted him. In an interview months later, Elton confessed, "I tried to reach him, but he didn't want help. He pushed people away. I wish I could have done more." It was the sound of a man mourning not just a friend, but a chance to say, "I'm sorry," a chance to hear "it's okay." But the truth is, George had already forgiven him in his own way, just not with words. He'd always believed forgiveness didn't need witnesses. It lived quietly in the spaces between melodies. In the softness of his later songs, "You Have Been Loved."
That man, she loved that man.
"My Mother Had a Brother."
My mother had a brother. They say that I was born.
And the haunting, waiting reprise.
There ain't no point moving on till you've got somewhere to go.
Listen to them now, and you can feel it, a piece that came too late, but came nonetheless. Friends who were close to George said he often spoke of Elton fondly in private, especially in his final years. He told one confidant, "He cared too much, that was his problem, but that's why I loved him." That line, never said in public, was perhaps the truest confession of all. And for Elton, the loss hit differently. He dedicated performances to George, sang "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me," with tears breaking through his voice.
Time stands still before me.
And admitted, he was one of the greatest, and I miss him every day. For once, the man who never stopped talking had nothing left to say. Because some stories don't end with closure, they end with echoes. The echo of laughter that once filled hotel rooms. The echo of applause that used to unite them. The echo of silence that outlasted everything else. Rumors still circle to this day. Some say they secretly spoke in George's final year. Others claim there were letters, apologies both ways. Nothing has ever been confirmed. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be proven, only felt. Because the story of George Michael and Elton John was never really about fame or ego or rivalry. It was about two men who loved too deeply, in a world that only saw the surface. Two souls who understood each other completely, but spoke different languages when it came to pain. And in that misunderstanding, they lost what could have been their greatest duet, the duet of forgiveness. But the music, it keeps them both alive. Every time Elton performs "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me," every time George's voice fills the airwaves again, it's as if the universe is giving them another chance to finish the song they left unfinished. Because that's what art does. It remembers what we forget. It redeems what we regret. And maybe that's why George never spoke about that night, because he didn't need to. His silence said everything. The pauses in his songs became confessions. The melodies became apologies. And the way his voice trembled, that was the sound of a friendship, still trying to make peace, somewhere beyond the noise. In the end, Elton said it best. The world lost one of its kindest hearts, and I lost someone I loved very much. But maybe he didn't lose him completely, because when the lights go down and the stage falls quiet, and Elton plays those opening chords once more, you can almost feel George there, smiling, listening, finally at peace, because in the end, he never wanted to lead. He just didn't know how to stop. Sometimes, the hardest part of loving someone is accepting that not every story ends with words. Some end in silence, and some in the songs they leave behind. George Michael's friendship with Elton John wasn't a tragedy. It was a mirror, showing us that even the brightest lights cast shadows, that sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones we end up losing quietly. If this story moved you, if you still feel that ache when an old George Michael song plays, you're not alone. Because these stories aren't really about the stars we lose, they're about what we remember in ourselves, when we listen. Thank you for watching RetroWaves, where the music never really fades, and neither do the people who made it. Make sure you subscribe if you believe some friendships deserve to be remembered forever.